David, the symbol of freedom of the Renaissance, the most famous statue in art history. Its creator, Michelangelo Buonarroti, is gifted with talents that enable him to achieve unprecedented things. His art is a beacon of light in the midst of the political and religious feuds of the time. His first great work, the Pieta, already makes him world famous.
He understood how the world really is.
As a sculptor, architect, and painter, he shatters norms and breaks taboos.
He has no particular respect for popes. He emancipates art from the desires of power.
He is a master of anatomy.
He uses the understanding of the muscles to create a kind of human drama.
A universal genius striving for absolute timeless beauty.
Michelangelo was already called Il Divino, the divine, by his contemporaries.
What drove the obsessive artist?
Two sculptors have tried their hand at this block before you. It's totally beaten up. It's useless.
The marble behemoth has been lying on the grounds of the Florence Cathedral building lodge for 30 years. 7 meters long, up to 2 meters wide, and weighing several tons. An unfortunate format on which all before Michelangelo had failed. Too narrow in relation to its length, which increases the risk of the marble breaking.
I see greatness. I can see him.
The sculptor has already accepted the challenge. He trusts his creative power.
You're obsessed.
He has an almost erotic relationship with stone. He wants to find the sculpture in the stone, and he is convinced that it's actually already there.
Michelangelo Buonarroti will create a sculpture from the colossal stone that will set new standards in sculpture and make him immortal.
He's in love with art. It's a deeply passionate relationship. Di profonda passione.
Passion that has its origins in earliest childhood. Michelangelo was a newborn when his father, Ludovico Buonarroti, an impoverished Florentine nobleman, gave him to a wet nurse in the country. This is the custom in aristocratic circles, even if his father can hardly afford it. The little boy enjoys a lot of affection with the stonemason's family and comes into contact with the material that will shape his life.
You make it like this, and I will make mine like so.
Michelangelo later jokingly recounts that his fate as a sculptor was shaped by those years when he drank marble dust with his wet nurse's milk.
And the rhythm of the hammer becomes his heartbeat.
That's very good. Hey, you're doing it really well.
Like this.
Just like that. Yeah.
He is not yet 3 when his father brings him back to his parents' house in Florence. These are gloomy times. The Medici banking dynasty dominates the city. Rival noble clans want to seize power from them. Easter 1478. The whole of Florence gathers in the cathedral for Mass.
My brother and I, we want to bring the best artists to Florence. We want the best art. We want frescoes. We want the best.
Among the visitors are the head of the Medici family, Lorenzo, and his brother Giuliano. They are the target of a conspiracy. The Pope is also involved in the plot. Giuliano bleeds to death. Lorenzo escapes injured and takes cruel revenge. He has the conspirators massacred and their corpses hung from the Palazzo Vecchio for all to see. The young Michelangelo grows up in this atmosphere in Florence, and the atmosphere in his parents' house is no less gloomy. Michelangelo's mother is dead, and his father is left alone with 3 adolescent sons. He is heavily in debt and has brought ruin upon the once noble family. The father vents his resentment on his sensitive and artistic son.
Again, for goodness sake! What on earth is happening here? Oh, really? We're nobles, not riffraff. You shall work, learn, like your brothers and sisters.
Michelangelo must have suffered a lot because of his father. He beat him. He actually wanted to prevent him from becoming an artist. He himself tells his own story as one of resistance against this paternal violence. That's important for him. At the same time, he can never get away from the man.
It will remain a love-hate relationship throughout his life, perhaps spurring his love of art even more. A copperplate engraving by Martin Schongauer fascinates the 12-year-old Michelangelo in particular. He takes it as a template and transforms it, inspired by nature. The fish scales become the demon's garments. The Temptation of St. Anthony is the only surviving painting of his childhood and already shows his extraordinary talent.
Michelangelo has painted it in tempera, added color, and we can see that he tightened the group, so the figural group is like a sculpture in the space of the painting, so that all our attention goes to the figures.
The strong plasticity of the composition already evinces the budding sculptor. Carmen Bambach researches Michelangelo's art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Her colleagues were also able to look under the layers of paint of the childhood painting.
We're looking at the painting in natural light on the left, and on the right, we're looking at the painting in infrared reflectography. And for me, what was really interesting was to really think about the vocabulary of these little stick figures that appear in the underdrawing in comparison to the drawings by Michelangelo on paper. You see the same kind of quickness. And this is a kind of technique of figural abbreviation that Michelangelo uses throughout his career. Importantly, we see that this is part of his language of sketching.
A sketching language that he would master in Florence. He grows up in a time in which the ideals of antiquity blossom anew and humanism places mankind at the center. An intellectual movement promoted by the Medici. Lorenzo de' Medici is both a despot and an admirer of beauty. He collects ancient art and supports talented artists. Thus, his court becomes the cradle of the Renaissance. His art agent discovers the talented Michelangelo.
Ciao. Ciao.
Against his father's will, he learns the marble craft in the Medici workshop, following the models of antiquity. And, just as a small child, he is captivated by the white stone.
That's going to be rubbish when it's finished.
What do you want from me?
Has his talent aroused the envy of his classmates? Or has he provoked them with his peculiar temperament?
Idiot.
His nose is broken during a scuffle. From then on, he feels disfigured.
La sua passione lo portava.
He was passionately attracted to beauty.
Una bellezza apparente.
And you know, that's why I think Michelangelo suffered a lot from being so ugly.
Sofferto del fatto di essere così brutto.
The supposed flaw will weigh on him for the rest of his life. and is perhaps one of the reasons why he avoids people all his life and devotes himself entirely to art. When his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici, dies, Rome becomes a refuge for Michelangelo. The eternal city with its ancient monuments, this is his world. The art scene takes notice of him, and soon he receives a unique commission from a French cardinal. He is to carve the Mother of Jesus, a life-size Pieta with the body of Christ. What a challenge for the 22-year-old artist. Unlike in painting, where corrections are possible at any time, in sculpture, every stroke with the chisel has to be spot on.
He concentrates exclusively on his work. He hardly eats, he doesn't sleep, he doesn't go out. Michelangelo devotes all his strength to the work. He knows that it requires his whole life. Nothing else exists for him.
The pressure weighs heavily on him. The statue is to be the most beautiful marble work of art in Italy. In view of the abundance of antique statues in Rome, this is a bold demand from his client.
We have letters from his father, who was very concerned about the dire conditions under which his son was working. He had been told that the boy was locked up in a hovel to work on this sculpture.
The torments Michelangelo suffered are apparent in one of his poems from that time. Only I am solitary in the shadows, whereas other men take their pleasure. I do but mourn, prostrate on the ground, lamenting and weeping. Meanwhile, in Florence, the world of humanism is under threat. Michelangelo's source of inspiration and the protective framework for his artistic creation. The fanatical monk Savonarola now rules the city. He has works of art destroyed and humanist books burned as the devil's work. Protected from the destroyers of his values, Michelangelo holds fast to humanist ideals in faraway Rome. With this sculpture. For 2 years, he works almost incessantly on his vision of the Virgin Mother with her dead son. His Pieta is a sensation among his peers. Maria is unlike the traditional figure of a woman bowed in grief. And Christ on her lap is not a typical man suffering with pain. Nothing on the spotless body is marked by mortal agony. The veins on his hand are plump, as if pulsating with life. No artist has dared to portray the theme in this way ever before.
Mary and her son touch us with their divinity, above all through their beauty.
This stark juxtaposition of suffering and death on the one hand and aesthetic beauty on the other, it's something that just convinced people instantly. We are looking at something special here.
This process, this torture while working, is of course also visible in the result. That's what makes this art so incredibly powerful.
The Pieta is the only work Michelangelo ever signed. After that, he no longer has to. He is world famous. He sends the lavish fee to his father, but keeps almost nothing for himself. But he remains lonely despite his success. Already then, rumors circulated about his love life. He writes many love poems, and all of them are about unhappy love. Oh, the lovers flee, flee from the fire of love. The wild fire doth rage terribly and deadly. Once the flames burn, neither strength nor reason nor flight will help thee.
His biographers, especially Condivi, construct this idea of a Michelangelo who only loved beauty platonically and suppressed his homosexuality. But in reality, Michelangelo fulfilled this passion. In the Renaissance, sexuality was lived very concretely.
During his time in Florence, Michelangelo wants to explore the human body in detail. At night, he steals into the Santo Spirito mortuary to dissect corpses.
Dr. Plackinger, Andreas Vesalius.
Many thanks.
Andreas Plackinger has analyzed the significance of dissections in Michelangelo's work and studied their role in Renaissance science and art.
Here we see an anatomist at work. He has placed his hand on the open corpse and is giving explanations. Michelangelo was also famous as a master anatomist, and this fascination with the human body and its anatomy, which was of course visible to contemporaries, naturally also led to people asking how these works came about.
Anatomists were quite often accused of corpse theft and murder.
For example, it is reported of Michelangelo, this is of course a rumor, that he killed a man in order to be able to depict a perfect Christ on the cross. That is, he nailed his model to the cross.
What fascinated him most about anatomy was the nature of the musculature. He knew exactly where each muscle was located and, typical of his time, began to make scientific records of the human body. Michelangelo obtained the flawless block of marble for the Pieta from the quarries of Carrara. Today we can still observe what a feat it was to extract the precious stone.
The problem with marble is the cracks. Customers want large blocks, but such a mountain of marble is crisscrossed by millions of natural cracks. And only sometimes, between 4 cracks, it's possible to quarry blocks of the required size.
It takes the diggers several days to break a block out of the mountain along 4 natural cracks. Then the blocks are cut with diamond wires.
The problem is, no one can predict whether the blocks you break out will be big, robust, and without defects. I always have this risk, even today, despite new technology.
From excavation to transport, today the workers in the Carrara marble quarries have modern machinery at their disposal. In Michelangelo's day, and well into the 19th century, workers excavated even the largest blocks out of the mountain using only a hammer and chisel. Then they slid the marble down to the valley on wooden sledges and pulled it with ox teams to the harbors by the sea. In 1501, Savonarola had been hanged in the meantime. Michelangelo returned to Florence at his father's insistence.
Watch out! Watch out!
The citizens of the city have a very special commission for him, a biblical figure for the cathedral. Hence, they carry the colossal block to him, several tons in weight and 7 meters high. It takes the men 4 days to erect it. It's unimaginable what would happen if it were to crack.
These were also dimensions that had been used to represent gods in antiquity. And that's where he saw his chance. He wanted to measure himself against the great works.
Michelangelo has a high wooden fence built around the block as a screen for fear of spies and the theft of his ideas. He planned something highly unusual for the time. It would be possible to walk all the way around his David.
The freestanding statue is also a sign of human freedom and self-determination. It is essential to the Renaissance philosophy, and it also emphasizes the impression of the monumental.
Once again, Michelangelo works like a man possessed. His contemporaries report that he even goes to bed with his boots on. He uses every second to contemplate his sculpture in advance, so that no miscalculated blow destroys the work. Franco Cervietti knows how to work with marble like no other. He makes copies of the most famous works and has carved all of Michelangelo's sculptures out of marble in their original size, including David, 6 times in total.
In order not to ruin it, you have to understand that you have to envision the sculpture in the block with its dimensions. You have to measure it before you knock something away. You see, even if it's only roughly chiseled here, you can already see a little of the line, the form. Only then can you understand whether you can strike deeper or not, and then you have to measure again.
A marble sculpture can only be created with a lot of experience, intuition, and a feeling for the inner life of the stone.
Every time I have a block of marble like this in front of me, I realize that no two are the same. Each block has a different quality. That is what makes it special. You have to know how to shape marble with a steady stroke and with the right tool. Then it comes alive. I've been doing this work all my life. It has become my fulfillment, my passion. You can live without marble, but I'm happier with it.
Despite the effort, the hard physical work is also exhilarating. Sometimes Michelangelo writes poetry about it. The hammer that chisels a human figure out of the hard stone must bend to my will, but it is God's will that guides my hammer to create the magnificent. The unveiling of David is a triumph. An anatomically perfect body as an expression of the freedom and sovereignty of the spirit that knows no subjugation, Michelangelo's David need not fear any Goliath.
People were simply overwhelmed. They hadn't seen anything like this before. It was new in this gigantic size. An Apollo-like David who also had the strength of a Hercules.
He's virtually the symbolic portrait of this young city that doesn't want to submit to the Medici, that doesn't want to submit to any ruler, to any emperor.
He was a humanist through and through, and you see that in David. He doesn't show the brutal act itself against Goliath, but what he shows is reflection. His act is planned, despite his physical beauty and the strength he radiates. And that is the ideal that Michelangelo wants to see embodied.
Michelangelo, an artist with divine inspiration and little ingenious ideas.
If you look closely, you can see this little heart on the eye, for example. You see, a little heart has been chiseled into it. Or here, in the hair, he has carved small holes in it that create a very special effect when they're seen from a distance. That's why his works are so special. Not everyone makes works like this. The look of David, the look of the man who kills Goliath. This is a strong man, even if he's smaller than the giant Goliath. He stands for strength and youth. And by emphasizing these things from a distance, they give the figure and the face of David an impression of more movement and more power.
David has become immortal. And whether it's everyday culture, pop culture, or advertising, people like to play with David and his ideal body. 500 years before, a new pope summons the famous sculptor from Florence to Rome again. Pope Julius II wants 40 sculptures as magnificent as David for his tomb. Michelangelo spends months breaking 40 marble columns out of the mountain himself. But then the Pope changes his mind. The artist should rather paint the vaulted ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with the 12 apostles. Michelangelo is furious. All that preparatory work for nothing. Besides, he's a sculptor, not a fresco painter.
A very significant dispute with the Pope ensues. Because Michelangelo negotiates with a client for the first time, with the most powerful client of all.
The dispute escalates.
And then he said, 12 apostles, that's a paltry request, I want more. And you might think, okay, now you're an artist and the Pope is the Pope. He's actually in charge, so you should really show your willingness to compromise. But Michelangelo was not willing to compromise. Looking for trouble is what you say today.
And Michelangelo gets his way. A ceiling fresco entirely according to his ideas. In place of a resplendent starry sky, he now wants to paint none other than the creation story.
Michelangelo is the first artist aware of the value of his art. This awareness leads him to place himself on, today we would say, almost equal footing with the Pope.
Such insolence.
You're too slow.
Especially as the sculptor has hardly any experience with the fresco technique.
Look after the colors.
What's more, his client's expectations are immense. The Sistine Chapel is one of the most highly consecrated rooms in the Vatican.
It's a gamble for the Pope to commission such a difficult painting from a sculptor who basically feels like a sculptor. But it's also a gamble for Michelangelo to accept the commission.
He enlists the help of fresco painters from Florence, but he soon dismisses them again.
Michelangelo is portrayed as someone who is a loner, who does not work well in a team at all. In fact, he wants to do everything himself.
He begins with the flood. But he quickly fails due to his inexperience. The fresco becomes moldy. Michelangelo has to chip it all off. And start again.
In a moment of difficulty, he wrote to his father, "It's my fault, because I was too presumptuous. It's not my job, but I wanted to do something I was not able to do."
The added pressure to complete the work does not ease his self-doubt. It is said the impatient Pope threatened to push him off the scaffolding if he did not finish soon.
Michelangelo is certainly an artist who struggles. Once he made a drawing about how hard the work was, having to paint the figures overhead all the time. He also struggled with the techniques until he found the ideal form.
And he finds it quickly. He uses the raw plaster as a color surface with virtuosity. That saves time.
In Michelangelo's hands, the fresco progresses quickly. Then, within a few months, Michelangelo becomes in fact the greatest fresco painter in the world.
He will create a fresco the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of the creation story, God creates Adam. A hymn to man in the image of God, his contemporaries rave.
God's not an oversized God the Father who creates a little Adam, but the two are at finger level. So one inspires the other. It happens together. It happens in dialogue. The fingers are not touching each other. It's simply the pointing finger, the idea, that is transmitted. Man is God's image, but that also makes him independent and autonomous in a way.
For almost 500 years, the fresco has captivated people. Even those who see it almost daily cannot escape its effect. Guido Cornini has the privilege of being able to enjoy the pictures undisturbed, even in the evening.
This frame above me, showing the creation of man with his hands meeting, is Michelangelo's greatest iconographic invention, because it shows the divine spark passing through man's life. So, the creature that comes to life from the very hands of God.
Barbara Giatta, the director of the Vatican Museums, is also very close to Michelangelo's works every day. She is particularly fascinated by his gift for thinking in perspective.
We must realize that he was working on a scaffold, or in any case at a very close distance, and therefore had to imagine the view from the ground.
Since the boards on which he painted prevented him from seeing from below, Michelangelo was left only with his imagination to picture himself in the situation of the viewers 20 meters below. In this, he benefits from his skills as a sculptor. This is impressively apparent in a tiny detail of the fresco, Adam's foot.
In Adam's case, he has prepared the fresco in great detail, with engravings in the plaster. Only the foot deviates from this. Instead of sticking to the pre-drawn engraving line, he enlarges the foot so that it has the right proportions for the viewer below.
But proportions are not the only challenge. To compose a virtuoso overall work on 540 square meters of wall space requires good organizational skills. But how? When most of the figures are already emblazoned on the ceiling, Michelangelo has a brilliant idea. He structures the ceiling with deceptively real architectural elements, columns, for example, which he embellishes with naked youths, the Ignudi, angels from the creation story. Originally, they were supposed to have wings, but he omits them. Instead, he stages them with perfect human bodies. And with human poses and gestures.
May I?
And something else is striking.
They're androgynous, that is, they're just as God created man in his image as man and woman. That is why they have male bodies and sometimes very feminine, graceful faces. That is the likeness to God.
Androgyny was one of the aspired ideals of the Renaissance. Androgyny was considered divine. In heaven, as it says in the book of Matthew, there are neither women nor men.
This is good.
What is also striking about the Ignudi is the movement of their bodies. This makes them appear almost weightless and adds an air of self-assurance to the display of strength.
When we look at both Michelangelo's sculpture and his painting, we realize that these are not natural proportions. The beauty of Michelangelo's painting and sculpture lies in the exaggeration of anatomy.
How he perfects his physiques is apparent in his preparatory study for the Libyan Sibyl, which is also part of the ceiling fresco.
Every time that I look at this drawing, I feel that I can look at it again and again and again and find new things. And here, for example, we see the muscles tensing underneath the skin, creating these fantastic patterns that seem so dramatic about the figure. It's as if the musculature becomes the protagonist of the body and the image that is being depicted. He uses the understanding of the muscles to create a kind of human drama, to create a sense of tension, and there is a certain beauty in the patterns of the muscles.
Michelangelo thus gives his figures a unique presence in space. He makes the bodies practically tangible.
Of course, his figures are still very much based on sculpture, but that lends itself very well to this fresco because it puts the human body right at the center. And it's a celebration of being human, of the human body, also of creation itself, which he creates there on the ceiling.
The ceiling fresco is finished in 4 years. It's a triumph. Michelangelo attains the aura of the painter of God. Since then, the Sistine Chapel has attracted visitors from all over the world who want to get a closer look at his frescoes. Up to 7 million art enthusiasts surge through the chapel every year. However, the air they breathe damages the frescoes, which were lavishly restored in 1982. The conservators are responsible for the atmospheric environment of the fragile interior.
It is important that the amount of CO2 that the visitors emit into the air in the room, the conservation of the chapel is, after all, dependent on the number of visitors, that this amount should not exceed a certain value. We therefore have 10 sensors that measure the airflow and air circulation in the chapel. We also have sensors that measure the CO2, sensors that measure the air particles, and sensors for the ozone content.
The data is transmitted to the control center and constantly evaluated.
This diagram shows us how the number of visitors is increasing, but the CO2 still does not exceed the limits. And it also shows us the amount of dust.
This is ensured by a special filter and circulation system.
The Sistine Chapel has a volume of 10,000 cubic meters. With a high visitor frequency, our system can renew the air up to 60 times a day.
In addition, the Sistine Chapel is inspected once a year and the frescoes cleaned. Michelangelo is already a legend in his own lifetime. His hometown of Florence overwhelms him with commissions, but war breaks out. The exiled Medici want to reconquer the Republic. Michelangelo, once promoted by the Medici, now their opponent, designs bastion towers for the old fortress. The Medici army and their imperial allies are not able to take the city for a long time. The Republic eventually falls after an 8-month siege. David's creator flees to Rome and will never return. He is now almost 60 and moves back to the center of antiquity, the part of the eternal city whose monuments and figures have always particularly inspired him.
Although Michelangelo had amassed an enviable fortune, he remained in the simple, very modest, almost poverty-stricken house all his life. And this despite the houses he had bought in Florence, despite the lands he had bought for his family.
In Rome, he will discover a new spiritual awakening. He meets Vittoria Colonna, the deeply devout Roman princess and celebrated poet. She is the great love of his life. He writes ardent love poems to her. It torments him that love should remain platonic. O thou doth sweeten my fate at last, my old heart from death doth shield, and hope eases the pain that wounds me with violent longing. Only death's nearness prevents Cupid's desire. Vittoria Colonna gathers church reformers around her, the spirituali, who sympathize with Martin Luther. They believe in the pure power of divine light.
Light is man's direct relationship with God, without institutional mediation. The Inquisition will accuse Vittoria Colonna of following a faith that does not recognize the mediation of Mary or the saints, but turns directly to Christ. This was a problem for the Inquisition, because the power of the Church of Rome was based on its cult of mediation and intercession. The masses were paid for, the relics were paid for. For Michelangelo, however, this was not the true faith.
What counts is a kind of inner enlightenment that enables us to be in touch with God and thus find a kind of personal salvation. This is the beginning of something completely new.
25 years after completing the ceiling, Michelangelo returns to the center of the Catholic Church with this new spiritual belief. Although the Pope knows about his critical attitude towards the Church, he commissions him to design the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel with the Last Judgment. And Michelangelo will use the commission to express his vision of the end of the world. Like an action film director, he stages almost 400 naked bodies between resurrection, heaven and hell around Christ the Judge.
The great novelty is that this judgment is a vortex in which it is not clear what one should do to go one way and not the other, precisely because there is not only one side to good and one side to evil. It is the first Last Judgment in which the cards are deliberately shuffled.
Michelangelo does not distinguish between the damned and the redeemed. No one is spared.
That is the difference to earlier judgment portrayals, that even the saints have to face the judge stripped and naked. And that was a scandal. No monk's robes and no royal robes can protect them. Only the judge decides.
The Last Judgment is certainly no picnic. It's a dramatic affair. I go to heaven and my neighbor doesn't, or vice versa. There's drama here, and that's why you can express it through an aesthetic ideal of dramatic figures. And many of Michelangelo's contemporaries also accepted this and went out amazed and said, right, this is how it has to be done.
Michelangelo creates his very own dramatic vision of heaven, and above all, of hell. Those who are damned are dragged down by the henchmen of the underworld.
We can assume that Michelangelo was deeply obsessed with the idea of the agony of death and eternal life, which gave him a sense of bewilderment, that sense of eternity changing forever. And that is what we observe in the fresco. It is a fresco of enormous drama.
Michelangelo worked on the Last Judgment for 5 years. 5 years in which he again devoted himself completely to his work, to the point of physical and mental exhaustion. And once again, he paints demons. His own, perhaps. He places the mouth of hell directly above the altar table, where the Pope celebrates Holy Mass. He has witnessed 11 popes, all of whom swindled the faithful. Does he want them to burn in hell for that? And he immortalizes himself on the altar wall. On the flayed skin of the martyr Bartholomew.
When he depicts himself in the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, then that is of course an indication of a large ego, immortalizing himself on the altar wall. And in a way it's a contradiction, this ego that promulgates itself in this fresco. And at the same time, if you like, he possesses humility.
With the Last Judgment, Michelangelo is not only dedicating himself to his work, he is also documenting his very own deeply felt faith.
Man is not saved because he follows the precepts of the Church, but because he behaves in a certain way in relation to God. This is a call to personal responsibility.
The whole Last Judgment is an attack on the Church. And the Church certainly perceived Michelangelo's criticism, even though it has to live with the fresco to a certain extent.
A newly elected pope approaches him and says that he should please paint over the naked bodies in the Last Judgment so that everything looks decent. And he replies, "Holy Father, I'll be happy to do that. Just one little thing. Make the world a decent place, then the pictures will be decent too."
Michelangelo's criticism of the Church does not harm him. Pope Paul III is so taken with him that he entrusts the now 72-year-old polymath with supervising the construction of the largest building site in Christendom, which has already swallowed up vast sums and become a huge building scandal, St. Peter's Basilica.
The status of being the master builder of St. Peter's naturally gives his life a new dimension. That is, he suddenly has the task of bringing something to completion that his colleagues had completely failed to do.
He designs the highest unsupported dome in the world.
A dome is actually also a sculpture, if you like. And when you look at the dome, with the ribs, and also with the windows, it has a sculptural quality.
Michelangelo is not deterred when a new pope persecutes the church reformers, cuts his salary, and stops the construction of the new cathedral. Another pope, another time will soon come. He did not live to see the completion of the dome, but it was built almost exactly according to his design. Today it is the landmark of Rome, the landmark of Christianity. Sunlight floods the church interior through 16 huge windows, a theatrical staging of the divine light at his great love Vittoria so adored. On the 18th of February 1564, Michelangelo died of a fever at the age of 89 in his simple home near the ancient forums.
Michelangelo was very robust until his death. He worked, sculptured, and rode around Rome on horseback. Imagine an 89-year-old man riding through Rome on his horse. That's how an eyewitness reported it. And he looked very good for his age, because he'd been physically active all his life, and because art was his life. He worked right up until his last day.
He destroys a large part of his drawings, as if no one should know the efforts and detours that went into creating his works. Michelangelo chose the city of Rome to live and die in, the city that paid him the greatest tribute and to which he gave works of timeless beauty.
He was never interested in worldly things or in the world of others. He had such an extraordinary world of his own.
The polymath, who was so strict with himself and faced his struggles throughout his life, could also be humorous. On the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, for example, he created a very lively god, from behind, with a pert bottom. But perhaps what distinguished him most was that he always followed his own will.
That's what makes his art so free and so strong and so dazzling to this day.
He dedicated his life to the search for reality, for truthfulness, for the soul of things, and thus also for the eternally enduring.
Michelangelo is the first person who can be said to have been truly revered like a god.
On the night of the 18th of March 1990, two men dressed as policemen enter the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston. They tie up the two night guards and walk directly to the Dutch salon where Rembrandt's works hang.
A part of our heritage has been stolen from us. It's a barbaric act.
Some of the paintings.
The thieves cut two Rembrandt paintings and 10 other works out of their frames. The paintings are worth $500 million. It is the biggest art heist in history.
Rembrandt ever painted.
Already a highly sought-after painter in his day, the Dutch master still enriches the world's most important collections today. Who was this Baroque genius who has enchanted people through the centuries?
Rembrandt was not only a miraculous talent as a painter, but he also had a mighty mind.
The Dutch artist seems to capture people's souls when he paints. His provocations are extremely modern.
When he painted a naked woman, for example, he did not depict her as an object of male desire, but as a victim of sexual abuse. He was one of the most innovative painters who has ever lived.
Today, scientists are peering beneath the rich layers of paint, trying to uncover the secret of Rembrandt's magic.
He was very conscious of himself as a kind of conjurer, as a magician, a craftsperson, but he was also aware that there were certain tricks of the trade.
For a time, the master leads a life blessed by light, soon to be overcast by the darkest of shadows.
They hanged him. The code thief, they hanged him.
Wonderful.
Rembrandt van Rijn has been waiting for this day for weeks. He has received an extraordinary commission. The surgeons of Amsterdam want to be painted by him. It is to be the young artist's first major work. To do this, he has to leave his studio and take part in a post-mortem.
Anatomy sessions were quite a public spectacle in the Netherlands at the time. There was music, people brought food and incense because the corpses stank. So it was really a very, very big show.
Only male criminals were dissected.
This man, contaminated by sin, he is now able, after his death, to do an honorable
Nicolas
task.
Tulp is Amsterdam's leading surgeon. He and his colleagues pay a lot of money for Rembrandt to portray their work on God's creature, man, for posterity.
To better understand the wonders of the
But how to portray a random group of surgeons and their lecturer in the right light? A tricky task for the young painter. After all, his clients want to be recognized clearly in the finished oil painting. All this during the spectacular autopsy in which Tulp exposes the flexor muscle of the arm. Rembrandt comes up with an ingenious trick for this. He practically stacks the surgeons on top of each other. However, the surgeons are not the main attraction in his portrayal.
What do we see in the center? The dead criminal, the corpse. At its core, the picture is dedicated to him. Even if it makes a very brutal impression at first, it shows the executed criminal as a human being capable of suffering.
And creates one of the most fascinating works in art history. But Rembrandt van Rijn dares even more. He has only recently moved to Amsterdam from the small town of Leiden. Now he is using the commission to make a name for himself. He cheekily shapes the belly button of the corpse as an R. The artist's signature also speaks volumes. Like the great masters, he only signs his work with his first name. He simply omits the Van Rijn.
There's also this sense of ego because, you know, we know Michelangelo and Raphael and Titian, but for a Dutch guy to just use his first name is quite unique. But with Rembrandt, you know immediately it's got to be that guy. In a way, it's like a neon sign on your paintings.
The young Rembrandt will make Nicolaas Tulp immortal with his painting. For the artist, the anatomy session is the starting point for a fabulous career that will lead him to the bright and dark sides of existence. The simple miller's son will revolutionize art.
If you go across the range of the human experience, there will be part of Rembrandt's oeuvre that will speak to that. Questions of love, questions of sexuality, questions of power, of violence, of loneliness.
Rembrandt van Rijn entered the world in Leiden in 1606. His ancestors named themselves after the river that flows through the city and past his parents' mill towards the sea.
I'm convinced that the mill as an object which reflected the light in a certain way was very important for young Rembrandt. He must have been attracted by the sun coming through these little windows, and this is of course a fascinating image which would have been in the eyes and the minds also of the famous painter that later on painted portraits.
The writer Onno Blom goes in search of the origins of the magician of light and shadow in his own hometown.
The first time the name of Rembrandt is written down on a document is in this book of the Leiden University. And in 1620, Rembrandt Hermanni Leidensis, who was the son of Herman from Leiden, Studio Literarum, was going to be studying the letters, the arts, on this university. He was Anno 14, he was 14 years old, a little boy with curly hair. And he lived with his parents, apud parentis. I think that he came here to the academy with his father, and the rector sat down and he put, for the first time in history, his name on paper. So this is magic for someone who loves Rembrandt.
The education that the craftsman's son received at the oldest university in the Netherlands would also directly influence his later works.
If you would have to say who Rembrandt really was, then he was a storyteller, a brilliant storyteller. All these stories from the Greek myth and from the Bible, Rembrandt painted afterwards in a very special way.
Biblical scenes or the depiction of ancient sagas, such as the rape of Persephone, become gripping stagings of human tragedies.
They even invented scenes that are not in the Bible. So, he could really play with the insightfulness that he had.
In keeping with the motto, nulla dies sine linea, since his earliest childhood, not a day goes by that Rembrandt does not paint or draw. He devotes himself to his passion. First, he opens his own studio in Leiden. Then, he tries his luck in Amsterdam, Holland's commercial metropolis. The young artist's light shines brightly. His exceptional talent is quickly recognized in the city.
God almighty, can't one have some peace around here? Go!
The influential art dealer Hendrik van Eilenburg promoted the willful painter.
Rembrandt.
What is it? I must crack on.
He arranges his first commissioned portraits, including that of the surgeons around Dr. Tulp.
I've brought someone with me.
But more importantly, he introduces Rembrandt to his cousin Saskia, who is in town for a visit.
Good day. Is it true that light and shadow come alive on your canvas? At least, that's what my cousin tells me.
Your cousin tells you that?
May I?
We can almost imagine Saskia Eilenburg as a fairy tale figure who suddenly entered Rembrandt's life. She was young, she was beautiful, she was rich, she was noble. She was actually more than Rembrandt, the miller's son, could ever have expected from life.
Naturally, it's not finished yet, but perhaps you can understand on principle what I'm aiming for.
What is that?
That's a secret.
Saskia is 20 years old. She comes from Friesland, from a traditional family of Calvinist solicitors and politicians.
She then leaves her Frisian homeland and moves to Amsterdam with him, and she really proves to be a stroke of luck for him in every respect. She probably often had his back, if only because, as a woman from high society, she had a better knack for dealing with well-heeled clients.
Will you be long? It's so cold without you in bed.
I still need a bit.
Not all the Eilenburgs were enthusiastic about Saskia's choice.
I think you need some yellow.
Oh. Hey!
You can't
Just
get
you wait!
Me. You can't get me!
About 3 months after their first encounter, the two become engaged and are married a year later. Saskia chooses the magician of light and shadow. Rembrandt is also popular among thieves. His works have been stolen from museums more than 81 times. One of his portraits is even called the Takeaway Rembrandt. It has already been stolen 4 times and reappeared each time. The Stockholm art heist kept the world on tenterhooks in December 2000. 3 men break into the Swedish National Museum with machine guns and steal 2 Renoirs and a Rembrandt. As a decoy, they set 2 cars on fire and then escape by speedboat. In 2005, the art treasures were returned to the museum. Such luck has so far eluded the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston. The 13 masterpieces stolen from there have been missing since 1990. A reward of $10 million has been offered for information on their recovery. Only one real Rembrandt remains in the museum. It shows the artist at the age of 23, one of his extraordinary self-portraits.
Immediately you see these dark, dark, dark pupils of the eyes looking out at us. And I think he knows that the way people look at pictures, they'll be struck it will always look like the eyes follow you. But in this case, it's the whole world of light and shadow that's going to follow you. So it's really very alive. And Rembrandt is a painter of that epiphany in the double sense. Both, it's an epiphany of his person, his coming to light, and it's an epiphany because it's the light that does it all.
Over 80 self-portraits by Rembrandt have survived. In these Baroque selfies, the artist perfects his portrayal of light and poses in a wide variety of costumes, from nobleman to beggar.
Rembrandt's later self-portraits, they're brutal because they're so realistic. You know, if he's got a big nose because of drinking, or if he's got yellow cheeks because his liver doesn't work anymore, or if it has warts or whatever, he will paint it. He doesn't do any concession to reality, as his philosophy was to really look at nature. So there is not a choice of making himself more beautiful, because that means that you have to fantasize about something that isn't there.
A stark contrast to his contemporary Peter Paul Rubens, for example, who, although already over 60, stylizes himself as a youthful, elegant artist. But is Rembrandt's honesty perhaps only an effect he plays with?
Even if you come so close, you don't really know who Rembrandt is. He comes forward, if you look at the painting, a self-portrait, as a fascinating person, but also he stays a mystery.
The works themselves also raise questions. In recent decades, there have been repeated doubts about the authenticity of some of the paintings, such as the man with the gold helmet. Art historians subjected it to intensive analysis. In 1986, they published their sensational result: not an original Rembrandt.
Don't apply it quite so thickly. The light is here on the outermost edges.
The scientists had noticed that the gold did not correspond to Rembrandt's usual painting style.
Better, yeah.
The picture was probably painted by one of the more than 50 apprentices Rembrandt taught. In recent years, however, some new, authentic Rembrandts have also come to light. The person responsible for that is Jan Six.
I talk about him so much, and I look at his work so much, and every day he sort of bumps into my life. He's ever present. So in a sort of an academic way or in a philosophical way, I'm almost married to Rembrandt.
Rembrandt is closely linked to Jan Six's family history. One of his ancestors was a friend of the master.
The first image I really remember is that little etching of Rembrandt sort of looking like that. And I think I tore it out, age 8 or 9, and hung it in my room. And he would always look at me. And from that very moment, I loved it.
While working for Sotheby's in London, Jan Six comes across a work by an alleged Rembrandt pupil in a catalogue in 2007. Auction price, £1,500. His client buys the painting. It later turns out to be a self-portrait by Rembrandt. In 2013, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles buys it for $16 million. And it is not the only time that Jan Six demonstrates his sensational instinct for Rembrandt's magic. Half of this biblical scene was painted over in the 19th century. Once again, Six believes he can detect the master's hand.
I saw a catalogue from a German auction house, and I went to Cologne. I saw the real painting, and I saw that parts of it was overpainted, but the figures in the background really looked original, especially that little boy looking out. And that face is really Rembrandt's face. So at that very moment, I decided for myself, this has to be by Rembrandt.
This time, Jan Six has to raise €1.5 million with an investor to buy the painting at auction. But the real adventure is just beginning. What lies beneath the painted-over areas? An X-ray promises more figures painted by Rembrandt's hand. Should one dare to remove the upper layers?
you see the X-ray, something is there. And so you ask the restorer, can you just take a little bit of the background away? And then first they say, well, really? And then you say, yeah, try. And so the first centimeters go off and the color comes out. And I remember, because it was done in England, I remember they called us and they said, there's color, you're right, there's color. And I said, continue. And they said, it's so scary. And I said, no, you have to do this because it's like Indiana Jones. It's like archaeology, it's an adventure. You can see in the right side, this is halfway the restoration, that the red color comes off and that the purple comes out. Also, you can see that the figure behind Christ is now gone, and the three figures that we're showing on the X-ray are actually emerging, they're coming out. You can see halfway that the little boy is losing his dress, and actually underneath a new body is emerging. I remember when these naked buttocks came out, we were so excited, and then we looked at each other and said, oh God, somebody thought this was a bit strange to paint the naked bum of a young kid. But at the same time, it's so natural, it's so real. I mean, this the innocence of young children. And of course, Rembrandt understood the Bible so well. And this whole story is about the innocence of the world. And what is more innocent than a naked child? So in a way, it started to make far more sense.
Although the young Rembrandt only half completed his painting, his pronounced ego and sense of humour are clearly visible.
Rembrandt positions himself above Jesus, and he's looking at you. He's saying, I did it, here I am. So it shows that he's very eager, and he's very self-confident. And I love that, because when you're in your 20s, early 20s, when you can start driving a car and when you can do all sorts of grown-up stuff, you're ambitious. You're experimental, and you're always bluffing. You're always a bit too big for life.
With this attitude, Rembrandt encounters an environment that offers him everything in abundance. When he sets foot in Amsterdam, the city is in its heyday. It is the golden age of the Netherlands, which becomes the dominant maritime and trading power in the middle of the 17th century.
In Amsterdam in particular, the riches of the world were quite literally piled up. Gold and ivory from Africa, tobacco and furs from North America, sugar and cocoa from South America, and pepper and nutmeg from Asia.
The population of Amsterdam grows from 40,000 to 210,000 during Rembrandt's lifetime. Living quarters are created at lightning speed. The rich merchants invest in real estate. This is how the Canal Belt comes into being. The city literally bursts at the seams several times. Amsterdam is booming. Ordinary workers here earn twice as much in the mid-17th century compared to those in Cologne, for example. Rembrandt is a child of his time, living it up, with a penchant for extravagance. He was particularly fond of exotic objects from faraway countries.
Interestingly, Rembrandt's adult life coincides exactly with the height of the Golden Age. If there was ever an artist who was born at the right time in the right country, it was Rembrandt.
Painters enjoy a high reputation in the city, and Rembrandt relishes his growing popularity. The melting pot of Amsterdam provides him with new motifs every day.
My name is Rembrandt van Rijn.
An estimated 5 million paintings were produced in the 17th century. And it's unique that at that time it wasn't just a small avant-garde, an elite that was interested in contemporary art, as is the case today, but broad sections of the population. Foreign visitors were always surprised that one could buy pictures at the market stalls in the Netherlands, and that carpenters and butchers had pictures hanging at home.
At that time, works of art were often even accepted as currency in Amsterdam. And in the pulsating world metropolis, the name Rembrandt soon ranks right at the top.
Keep still.
But I am holding still.
Yes, too still.
Merchants like Martin Solmans, who had amassed fabulous wealth through trade, had themselves immortalized by the artist more and more often, for no one painted people like Rembrandt.
With almost every Rembrandt portrait, you see something that is uncompromising. Sometimes you get a sense that it was production and the bills had to be paid, but almost always you get a sense that there is a new invention to be brought out. And Rembrandt is giving himself a challenge because that is how he sees art, at least the art that he makes.
By incorporating accessories, for example, Rembrandt also tells stories in his portraits, and he makes up small actions that bring movement into the picture, a masterly trick. In this way, static poses become a lively snapshot that he captures on canvas. Martin Solmans is to marry Opien Koppit, the wealthy daughter of a gunpowder merchant. The wedding painting of the two is to be more impressive than anything that has been done before. Until now, a life-size painting was reserved for royalty.
Many of his works have their explanation in his singular devotion to being and performing the role of a great artist. Even a king couldn't get an audience with him and had to wait until he was ready and had finished what he was working on.
In 2016, the wedding portraits of Martin and Opien become a sensation. After 400 years in private hands, they are offered on the market. France and Holland join forces and acquire the duo for 160 million euros. Now you can admire Martin and Opien, sometimes in the Paris Louvre and sometimes in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. The couple moves every 5 years. Pieta Nobel, senior conservator at the Rijksmuseum, was asked to assess the condition of the paintings before the purchase in the private chambers of the Rothschild family.
The paintings hung in a bedroom with open doors onto the garden. There was a busy street not far away, from the garden. So I think over the years, there was actually a sort of a layer of sort of grimy soot that had accumulated on top of the paintings.
Together with her team, Pieta Nobel freed the couple from centuries of yellowing, repaired damage, and restored them to their original appearance. It is precisely in the tiniest details that Rembrandt's genius, and also his inventiveness, is revealed.
What is so stunning is that the general impression, from a distance, is that this is a real lace collar. I mean, it really gives you the impression that that he depicted that in a lot of detail. But in fact, when you get up close, it's nothing more than just little dabs and licks of black paint on top of this white layer.
Contrary to what one would expect, Rembrandt did not paint white lace on a black background, but the other way round. He was a master of illusion, who knew all the tricks and invented new ones. But he was unrivaled in capturing the essence of those he portrayed.
The amazing thing is that you somehow believe that you're actually looking at the person. With other painters, they're often just lifeless mannequins. But with Rembrandt, you think you know the character of the person. Sometimes you have the feeling that they're still alive, that they could walk through the doorway at any moment. You can't really explain it. It remains somewhat mysterious.
That person is really gazing, and you really have a sense that something is going on. Because you get this interaction. He sort of hooks you in, and he takes you along. And that's quite rare for an artist.
He portrays fear, he reveals melancholy. He actually lays bare everything known to human existence.
In the Rijksmuseum, just a few meters away from Martin and Opien, is Pieta Nobel's new workplace. She is in charge of Operation Nightwatch. Under this name, one of the most comprehensive restoration projects in art history began in July 2019. Rembrandt's monumental painting, his most famous work, The Night Watch, is being examined with unprecedented detail.
The sheer size of the painting has meant an enormous amount of challenges involved in researching the painting, but also just in simple things like how do you go about, digital photography of such a large painting? How are you going to capture all those images?
Ultra-high resolution scans provide the basis for the restoration of Rembrandt's masterpiece, which will take years.
It's the national painting, you could say. It's in the Rijksmuseum. It's hanging like the top piece on an altar. It's like the temple of art, and the best piece in it is The Night Watch.
I don't know if that is his best painting, but it doesn't really matter, because it's clearly the greatest endeavor. It was really showing this is what I am capable of, and it's a pretty awesome big picture.
The guard of Amsterdam, who would otherwise be sitting kind of in a static portrait, are suddenly coming up to us. The picture has this sense of momentariness.
You can hear the gunfire, you can hear the drum beats, you can almost smell the gun smoke. This image is highly sensorial.
The illustrious group is typical of Rembrandt's time. A marksman's guild that provides security in Amsterdam as a vigilante group. The giant of art immortalized himself once again in this monumental work. Petria Nobel is still impressed by Rembrandt's painting technique, even after many years.
He's using different kinds of tricks that any other artist does. You have two details of the painting right next to one another. Of course, the lieutenant built up in this really thick impasto in multiple layers. And when you get even closer, you can sort of see, that he's really daubed that paint on. I mean, under a microscope, it almost looks like ice cream. Right next to it, you have this really summary execution of the dog. The dog sort of is meant to kind of blend away in the background, where the lieutenant is meant to come forward. That's how he builds the composition and creates that suggestion of depth in the painting.
Few people know that the Night Watch was originally much larger. When it was transferred to Amsterdam City Hall in 1715, something happened that would be unimaginable today. It doesn't fit through the doors, so the mayor has the work trimmed on all four sides. No one knows what these missing parts look like, but at least a copy of Rembrandt's masterpiece exists, made by the painter Gerrit Lundens in 1650. It is the basis for a spectacular project.
There are several things that are present in the Lundens, but missing in the Night Watch. Apparent difference is that on the Night Watch, this figure here wearing the helmet has been cut off, whereas in the Lundens, we see his arm back here, and in fact, there are two missing figures, and if you look closely, there's even a little boy down here looking over the wall.
The missing sections will be reconstructed with the help of deep learning algorithms. To do this, the technology is first fed hundreds of details from both images.
I use this alignment between the Lundens and the Night Watch to basically send the neural network to art school. So what you're seeing here in these examples is a little tile from the Lundens, and then the same tile from the Night Watch. And so this is basically a quiz that we're giving the neural network. We say, all right, paint this like Rembrandt would paint it. And this is its best guess.
After hundreds of thousands of cycles, the missing parts of Rembrandt's Night Watch are then calculated from the data. And this is the result.
So in here, in the middle, you see the night watch, and then along the edges, you can see the extension from the neural reconstruction.
In this way, the museum creates a unique reconstruction of the night watch, which gives an idea of how Rembrandt probably really planned his work. And it enables new insights, especially with regard to the positioning of the figures.
This strip of about 60 centimeters from the left side has a huge impact on the original composition. We get a great sense of how Rembrandt used, perspective in the painting. I mean, the fact that we now the figure is holding onto this railing, I mean, certainly, leads you much more into the composition, and there's much more of a sense that the figures are now not in the center of the painting, but actually off-center.
Since the additions were made by computer and not by Rembrandt's hand, in the future, the night watch will be displayed in the familiar form that enchants millions of visitors to the Rijksmuseum every year. When Rembrandt receives the commission for the night watch, he is 34 years old. He is at the height of his creative powers. Amsterdam's elite are at his feet. His marriage to Saskia has granted him a life of wealth. He acquires a stately home, which he fills with art from all over Europe, and his collection of historical and exotic exhibits. He captures this flight of fancy in a self-portrait. It shows him and Saskia as a couple who enjoy life.
Rembrandt was sometimes criticized for his extravagance. For example, his wife Saskia's relatives accused him of throwing money out of the window with both hands. Interestingly, he didn't deny this at all. He only said, "Yes, we can afford it because we've been so richly blessed by God Almighty with money and goods."
Saskia's dowry of 40,000 guilders was used up only a few years after the wedding. Rembrandt knew better than anyone, where there is light, there must be darkness. And the darkness that fell over his imposing house was long and gloomy. Saskia gave birth to 3 children. All 3 died after a few days or weeks. Then finally one son, Titus, survives.
Look what Papa is doing.
Rembrandt, Titus scolds you. You should paint faster.
Papa needs a bit of quiet.
Their happiness is short-lived. Saskia dies at the age of only 30, when Titus is 1 year old. The 4 pregnancies had taken their toll on her, and tuberculosis was most likely her death sentence. Saskia's death is the turning point in Rembrandt's life. His masterpiece, The Night Watch, is almost finished. He does not yet suspect it, but his glory days are over forever.
Saskia's death was a great shock to him. This is reflected on the one hand in the moving drawings he made of her in the last phase of her life, but also in the fact that he immediately fell into a deep creative crisis afterwards and painted almost nothing for 10 years.
Stephanie Buck and her colleagues at the Copperplate Etching Museum in Dresden are studying Saskia nearly 400 years after her death. Just as he was able to create a monumental painting like the Night Watch, Rembrandt also captured private details with great sensitivity.
We're sitting in front of one of the most beautiful drawings by Rembrandt ever. At least it is one of the most beautiful for me. This is his wife Saskia. a very intimate format. His way of portraying life is so captivating. The way the pupil is positioned, the relationship between the nose and the corner of the mouth. These are just tiny dots, tiny little strokes.
A spot of light on Saskia's head has aroused the interest of the researchers. Did Rembrandt subsequently correct the spontaneous sketch? A technical analysis might shed light on the matter. The valuable artwork is irradiated with different light wavelengths that do not damage the unique etching.
Ja, also ist doch gut, wie das Licht da gesetzt ist. Das ist keine Korrektur.
In the infrared image, we could clearly see with very long wave light that this brightness around the face was in fact applied with a watery chalk, so that he did not make a correction, but added an additional source of light afterwards. This causes Saskia to naturally shine out of the picture more strongly. And it was obviously important for him to set this light again in this way.
When it comes to lighting design, Rembrandt was the absolute master. Even today, camera technicians use his methods to set the scene for faces, as seen here in the interview with art historian Franziska Gottwald and David de Wit, chief curator of the Rembrandt House in Amsterdam.
When you look at his character studies and depictions of heads, it's often noticeable that the treatment of light, or how light is depicted, or how a head is illuminated, seems unusual.
Gottwald and de Wit wanted to find out how Rembrandt succeeded in creating atmosphere through the use of light. Even when he had to carve the motif into the metal plate with a needle, he mastered the play of light like no one else. For example, in this etching. The scientists discover something astonishing in connection with this piece. Rembrandt reveals the secret of how he influenced the light in his studio, with a fabric construction over the window.
The cloth increases the diffusion of light in the room, making it softer and dispersed. But you can also see that these windows are blocked at the bottom. The aim is to have light from above, not only from the window, but also from above.
In this way, the master creates a light that gently envelops his models.
He uses light not only to create space, but also saw the potential of using light alone to create or bring out emotional states more intensely.
After Saskia's death, Rembrandt withdrew from the world. His stubbornness and undiplomatic nature meant that he hardly received any more commissions in the following years. Court records tell of ever greater financial problems. He spends more time in nature now.
The etchings, when you look at them the first time, you do think that a lot of it is just dark scribble. Sometimes there's nothing but darkness. And if you allow yourself to look just a little bit longer, all of a sudden, bam, you see it's not all dark.
There are an incredible number of things to discover in this landscape. On the one hand, these windmills that we can recognize, of course, but also lots of people. We have a farmer and a farmer's wife. Then we have a draftsman on the horizon on the right. And we have a very mysterious pair in the foreground, perhaps lovers.
Rembrandt's contemplation of nature has always been directed towards the human, and even the very human. His candor shocks. His nudes vex his contemporaries.
The print is famous for the fact that it was also criticized for being so candid, when people in the Academy thought that one had to follow norms and rules. And here, for example, you can see the imprint that garters make, and that was simply not considered appropriate for a nude. This is a corporeality that simply reminds us that bodies are like that. Whether that's brutally honest is something you have to think about, because who is being cosseted? When we look in the mirror in the morning, we're not cosseted either. So it's a detail that brings the vitality of life itself into the etchings.
Rembrandt has not lost his sense of humor, even as a widower, nor has he lost his knack for telling stories.
At the back, in the distance, you can see a reaper cutting the grain. This means that we, as viewers, know that, of course, this burst of passion will probably be over quickly when they are discovered.
The artistic obscenities fit in with the slovenly life Rembrandt leads in the eyes of Amsterdam society. For years, he had a love affair with the nurse Geertje, who raised his son Titus, and he made promises of marriage to her.
Imagine that this is all water here. You're standing in water.
In water?
Splash! Splash! Splash!
When he turns to the prettier and younger maid Hendrikje, who also frequently models for him, things come to a head.
Oh, Rembrandt! The other side too.
The jilted Geertje sues Rembrandt and wins alimony in court. He takes revenge and has her locked away for 5 years in a women's penitentiary.
Geertje Dirks is the dark chapter in Rembrandt's life. If we look at his behavior today, even if we take into account the standards of his time, we have to conclude that the same person who created such tremendously sensitive works of art could be harsh and unforgiving in his personal life.
But Hendrikje Stoffel stays with Rembrandt. She becomes the second important woman at his side. Together they have another daughter, Cornelia.
Hendrikje Stoffels was a very simple woman who couldn't even read and write properly. But she must have been very astute, because when Rembrandt had to declare bankruptcy in 1656, Hendrikje founded an art trading company and took Rembrandt on as an employee so that he could concentrate entirely on his art. And that is how his legendary late work came about.
The late Rembrandt artworks break with the conventions of the time. He scales everything down to the essential, radical and modern from today's point of view.
Rembrandt works very intensively with individual blobs of colour, and sometimes he simply makes use of our brain's ability to complete something that's not even there. He even omits some things, and we still know that it's a hand. That is the crease of an arm, because we complete the picture ourselves. So he's concerned with showing a state of mind or showing a state of being and somehow conveying that to us. That's ultimately something that modern painting, especially Impressionism, picks up on later.
The art critics of his time despised this way of painting. But Rembrandt's way of painting points far into the future. Can artificial intelligence copy the genius? An advertising agency commissioned computer scientists to teach algorithms to paint like Rembrandt. To do this, they had their computers analyze all 340 of Rembrandt's paintings.
It is true that Rembrandt is kind of the pop star of Dutch arts and culture and the Dutch masters, and we could have gone with Van Gogh maybe as well. But the important thing with Rembrandt is there's a lot of data available.
The AI drew its conclusions from millions of data. What does a Rembrandt nose look like? How far away are the cheekbones from the eyes? The algorithms analyzed the facial parts and then created their own work. The biggest challenge remained: how to print Rembrandt's voluminous color application on a canvas, sometimes with centimeter-thick layers of paint. The technicians mastered this hurdle as well and developed their own printing process. The result was presented to the public and to an extremely skeptical art scene as the next Rembrandt.
One reaction was quite outspoken, which was, I would be the antichrist of the art world. And there's a very famous Rembrandt expert who actually came and who had his magnifying glass, and he looked at the painting and he said, "This is prostitution of Rembrandt." Do we want, as humans, compete with AI when it comes to art, or is that meant for humans, and is this just to help create new and more beautiful things? And I think it's the latter.
What would the master himself have thought?
If Rembrandt were to see the recreated Rembrandt today, he would probably grab his brush and fix it.
Rembrandt survives his son Titus and Heinricha, the woman who stood by him even without a marriage certificate. Both died of the plague, which raged twice in Amsterdam between 1660 and 1670. In the end, he lives a secluded and lonely life, with only his daughter, Cornelia, looking in on him from time to time. His contemporaries did not know what to make of his painting style.
There is a strong sense that Rembrandt himself knew that he was painting in order to be timeless in not a metaphysical sense, but like in a historical sense, timeless in the sense that his work will always look fresh, deep into the future.
I do think that the more and more we start to understand more about ourselves, about our own ego, and about our own position in life and how we treat reality, we start to understand more and more about Rembrandt. I think he was just light years ahead in observing.
But still, even if you know him so well, if you come so close, he stays a mystery.
This image of the tragic genius between genius and madness.
A painter who lives with prostitutes.
That is a lie!
Who is considered a troublemaker by his colleagues. Who mutilates himself out of despair.
A very difficult person to place.
Vincent van Gogh dies poor and misunderstood. Who was he really? A madman or a genius with a very vulnerable soul? Researchers are using state-of-the-art methods to find the real Vincent van Gogh behind this mysterious figure.
He has very high ambitions, very high hopes, big dreams.
They want to unlock the secrets of his art and to shed new light on the low points of his life.
It's phenomenal to think that he managed to accomplish this within a space of 10 years, to become a leading member of the avant-garde, starting from somebody that could hardly draw.
The results of science paint a new, startlingly different picture of this giant of art. Here in a mental asylum, Vincent van Gogh produces some of his greatest masterpieces. The former monastery of Saint-Paul-de-Mosol near Saint-Rémy in Provence. In May 1889, the Dutchman seeks refuge behind its thick walls from the life that overwhelms him. Refuge from the people who don't understand him. And he hopes for help in the face of the mysterious seizures that haunt him. What keeps Van Gogh alive is his art. He wants to, he has to, keep painting. The starry night. No one before him had ever painted a night sky in this way. Instead of depicting reality true to nature, Van Gogh alienates and abstracts, thus anticipating modernist painting. In the mental asylum in Saint-Rémy, Vincent van Gogh struggles with the greatest crisis of his life. After a strange quarrel, he mutilates his left ear. Flurries of mental derangement keep him from painting again and again. He eats paint and drinks turpentine.
Van Gogh says that he has hallucinations, that he hears things that he really didn't during those attacks, that he doesn't know what he's doing.
Van Gogh suspects that his feverish creative work is partly to blame for the seizures. He accepts them as the price to pay for great art. He wrote to his brother Theo, "My pictures cost me dearly, sometimes perhaps even in blood and brains." In fact, Van Gogh wears himself out painting. 362 paintings in the last 2 years of his life alone. And he revolutionized art.
You have to understand that what Van Gogh was making at the time was quite out of line of everything. The thing that he added to art and art history is the fact that you can think of the world as something in lines, that you see movement in his pictures, and that's something totally new.
But above all, Van Gogh depicts the world in completely new, luminous colors.
He was constantly pushing the boundaries, so there's a kind of level of intensity to his color in many of his paintings that was really novel in his time. Since then, we have Andy Warhol and Gerhard Richter and other colorists who played at the very edges of what color can be, but we have to think back what this looked like in the 1880s. It was very shocking.
In his day, the verdict was that such art cannot be the product of a healthy mind. But this assessment is overturned in the following decades.
Somehow he becomes Vincent van Gogh, the creator of this huge body of masterpieces that have won over the hearts and minds of the world.
What was his driving force? Are his paintings the spontaneous result of his madness, or the expression of a highly sensitive artist's soul? Anyone who wants to understand Van Gogh and his gigantic oeuvre will probably come closest to him in Amsterdam. As the world's largest collection of the artist's work, the Van Gogh Museum attracts millions of visitors year after year. But his works are also meticulously studied here. In order to preserve them for posterity in the best possible way, researchers want to understand exactly how Van Gogh's masterpieces were created and how they were originally intended to appear.
It really started when we started to examine each painting one by one, taking it out of its frame. Often underneath the frames, where the paint has been protected from light, there were remnants of a much brighter colour around the edges.
The intense colours make Van Gogh's sunflowers the eye-catcher of every exhibition. What might the magically luminous still life have looked like fresh on the easel? That's what a unique experiment by the museum aims to show. The search for the secrets of Van Gogh's colours begins in the laboratory of the Imperial Cultural Heritage Office of the Netherlands, with tiny samples of the painting. Under the microscope, the cross-sections make layers of colour that have already faded on the surface visible again. Van Gogh's very volatile red, for example. A mass spectrometer reveals the chemical elements contained in each sample. These, in turn, reveal the composition of the colours and reveal the extent of the discoloration. But the researchers do not leave it at that. They want to combine science and art. Their new knowledge makes it possible to reproduce Van Gogh's original colours using old recipes from the archive. The aim of the project, to have the famous masterpiece copied as accurately as possible. The museum entrusts Charlotte Kaspers, artist and restorer, with the task.
So that's a really strange thing about the sunflowers, actually. Everybody in the world knows them, but the painting already has aged, so it's like an old person you get to know, whereas it has been just newly born when it came from Van Gogh's easel, and then it was really bright. It's famous, everybody knows it, but not in the way he made it.
Charlotte Kaspers has to understand the structure of the painting in detail before she can reconstruct it. To do this, she uses X-ray images, color cross-sections, so-called XRF scans, and transmitted light photos of the painting.
So all these things combined, give quite a good plan of how to start and what to use, how to work. I love doing this, and I always do this with a lot of respect because it also feels very private. When you go so deep in somebody else's work, you see what he was looking for, searching for, why he made changes. Yes, it feels very intimate.
For Charlotte Kaspers, repainting the sunflowers means channeling Van Gogh, feeling how he was, who he was. Vincent was born and raised in Groot-Zundert, a village in the south of Holland. His father, Theodorus, is a strict Protestant priest. Mother Anna, bourgeois and status-conscious, keeps her children away from the poor peasant children. But the siblings have each other. Vincent is especially close with his little brother Theo. He invents games for him, and they explore nature together.
Vincent, see here, I found an egg. Great, take it to Mama.
Theo is Vincent's closest confidant throughout his life, perhaps the only person who ever really understood him.
He seems to have been, to a certain extent, indeed, a lonely boy too, I tend to think, an outsider.
And an oddball. Tirelessly and meticulously, he collects, examines, and catalogues beetles, plants, and birds' nests. He lives in his own world. He devotes himself to things that excite him with an almost fanatical devotion and passion.
Vincent, dinner is ready. Can I just finish doing something? You must come down now at once. No!
Little Vincent often argues with his parents and withdraws from them.
His father and his mother believed that it was crucial for their children to temper their speech, to temper their emotions, and to live life in an orderly way. And all of a sudden they have this child who, right from the beginning, didn't conform to anything. In fact, the maids called him the strange boy.
His whole life, Vincent's parents do not accept that he is different and deny him the recognition he so longs for. At a loss as to what to make of their strange boy, they arrange for him to train in his uncle's art printing empire. Vincent is 17 years old at the time. For the first time, he finds himself in the world of art, as a salesman. This only existing photo of him is taken 2 years later, when Vincent is transferred because of his rude manner.
And he was shipped off to be a shipping clerk at the Enterprise in London. He was fired from that. He goes to Paris and he insulted the clients. If somebody was looking at a painting that he didn't like, he would go up to them and say, only somebody with terrible taste would be interested in that, in the enterprise he was working in. So they not only fired him, they banished him from ever stepping foot in the gallery again.
He was a bookseller. He went back to London and to England again, and there he worked as a teacher in a school for a very poor salary.
At that point, he basically tried to become a missionary.
The Borinage coalfield in Belgium. After his constant failure, Vincent finds work as a lay preacher here at the age of 25.
Jesus Christ was a carpenter's son. He worked for 30 years in a humble workshop. He was a laborer with marks of weariness and of suffering on his face. Just like you, who simple and proud and believing in God, enter the mind day after day. We talk of revolution, but God wants us to live humbly on this earth of his, this blessed
Van Gogh
earth.
wants his congregation to live as simply and piously as he does. His sermons are not only muddled, however, they also strike the wrong note. The downtrodden miners are not comforted by Van Gogh's words. They see the young man rather as a religious fanatic who overdoes it with his priestly existence. He lets himself go to such an extent that even the dusty coal miners consider him a filthy disgrace. Once again, Van Gogh fails here too, despite his deeply and sincerely felt religious vocation.
It says here. It's really very easy. It's in here. It's all in here.
His community turns away from him. They even ensure that he is recalled. For Vincent, it is the lowest point of his life so far. He is penniless, unemployed, aimless. His decline also disturbs his family. His own father wants to have him committed to a mental institution.
It gives you a sense of what the family felt about him, that they thought he needed to be committed. I don't think it takes Sigmund Freud to understand that for many of us, trying to live up to our parents' expectations, especially when we haven't done that, is a very strong motive force, and it certainly was for Vincent.
He is extremely disappointed to have failed again, to be abandoned by everyone again. Deeply despondent, Vincent writes to his brother Theo.
He was searching for a place in the world for himself. I think he was longing to console people, but also to be consoled.
Together with other art historians, Nienke Bakker has analyzed the extensive correspondence between Vincent and Theo. The letters provide a unique glimpse into Vincent's thoughts, plans, and inspirations, and also his spiritual life. Thanks to the letters, we also learn of Theo's reaction to his brother's despair. He responds with a proposal that gives Vincent a new lease of life. Theo knows his older brother likes to draw. If Vincent would like to try his hand as an artist, he would support him financially. Still in Borinage, Vincent sets to work. At the age of 27, an age when other artists are creating masterpieces, Van Gogh is still painting rudimentary figures in pencil. Van Gogh is not gifted with natural talent, but just as his tendency to excess was disastrous in bourgeois life, with art, his fanatical zeal will prove to be a stroke of luck. He works tirelessly.
move a little. Yes.
In The Hague, he finds a deaf-mute pensioner who lets him dress him up for a pittance. At the time, Van Gogh struggled with dimensions and perspective. He therefore made use of a perspective frame as an aid. In his letters to Theo, he enthusiastically describes its construction and function. In fact, the self-taught artist will be dependent on this crutch for a long time. This is apparent in works created years later, like this one for Montmartre in Paris. The auxiliary lines are visible here even to the naked eye. Van Gogh, who stubbornly refuses a classical artist's training, needs the aid to convey dimensions correctly on the canvas. At the time, Van Gogh was living with Sien Honeck, a prostitute with illegitimate children, much to the displeasure of his family.
Vincent knew that his parents and also Theo were against this relationship, but he also felt very attached to her and to her children. This is the only time that he actually had his own family.
Vincent gives in to pressure from his family and ends his relationship with Sien. Despite his nonconformist nature, he longs for companionship. Yet once again, he is alone. Five years into his career as an artist, at the age of 32, Van Gogh believes he has finally created his first great masterpiece, The Potato Eaters. For months, he painted portraits and made individual studies for this picture. As an artist, he hopes for the recognition that is denied him as a human being. The reactions to the earth-colored work, however, are painful. His brother Theo and fellow painters considered it old-fashioned and unsellable. He finally enrolls at the Art Academy in Antwerp that wants to put him in the beginner's course. Van Gogh is in danger of failing on this classic path of a painter, even at the basic skills that are required. So how does this amateur become one of the greatest artists in history? Christie's auction house in New York in 1990. Seemingly out of nowhere, a painting appears on the auctioneer's stage that has not been seen in public for decades.
26 million, 27 million, 28 million, 29 million.
The famous portrait of Dr. Gachet. Painted in 1890, it is the last major portrait the Dutchman painted before his death. It shows Van Gogh's neurologist, Paul Ferdinand Gachet. When Van Gogh made it, he was so poor that he had to keep exchanging drawings and paintings for food and paint.
Selling in the room now, all done then, against the telephone, not yours here, fair warning, at $75 million. For you, sir, $75 million.
$75 million. This makes the painting the most expensive work of art of its time. The buyer, a Japanese businessman. The story of Dr. Gachet, however, is not only one of top prices, but also an art thriller. The Städel Museum in Frankfurt is involved. In 2019, it celebrates Van Gogh as the inspiration for the German Expressionists with an exhibition, and explains why Van Gogh became so popular in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. The fact that Dr. Gachet, of all people, is missing from this exhibition is all the more regrettable for the museum, as it had acquired the famous portrait in 1911. The only remnant of the famous portrait is stored in the museum's painting depot in the basement. It is the original frame for Dr. Gachet, kept as a reminder of scandalous events.
That was really one of the key works here in the collection. He was initially presented in his pioneering role, in his role as an inspirational figure of the German avant-garde. And I also think that was part of the downfall because, of course, these were the artworks that were taken down here in the museum in 1933.
Provenance researcher Iris Schmeisser had delved deeply into the Dr. Gachet case file for the Städel Museum. The National Socialists' justification for the confiscation: problematic foreigner.
And with regard to the so-called problematic foreigners, that's a quote, that's really the term that was used, which also included Van Gogh. There was talk of mental perversion, aberration, degeneration, being out of sorts.
Dr. Gachet ends up in Berlin, along with paintings by other denigrated artists.
They were first stored there in a granary, and then Hitler and Goebbels inspected these stocks. And in this context, we can assume that they planned to exploit these products of decaying art, in inverted commas, to make money. And Dr. Gachet then became something like a pilot project to try this out.
Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring sells the painting to a dealer in Amsterdam. Here, its trace is lost, until it reappears at the auction in New York 50 years later, only to disappear from the public eye once again. But how did the Potato Eaters painter become the famous Dr. Gachet painter? How did Van Gogh progress from the dusty earth colors to the garish contrasts? The transformation takes place in Paris in 1886, where Vincent van Gogh finds the style that makes him immortal as an artist. Vincent soaks up everything Europe's art capital has to offer, like here in the Louvre.
He had something like a photographic memory. So when he would sit and study a painting, which he could sometimes do for as long as a day, he would remember the passages of color, brushwork, that created a kind of imaginary museum.
This insatiable thirst for art is only one reason for his visit to Paris. Here, Vincent is also reunited with his brother Theo, who lives in Paris as a successful art dealer.
You're always welcome in Paris. Come, let's go home.
Theo's monthly cash injections are hardly enough for Vincent's artistic ambitions. He is simply looking for a cheap place to live, and therefore wants to move in with Theo. Construction of the Eiffel Tower is just beginning in Paris. Industrialization changes the city, and science changes the way we look at the world. Photography makes it possible to capture their image. Classical painting faces serious competition. It is an overwrought, fatalistic time. L'envie de la boue, the desire for booze and excess, reigns in the city's cabarets and cafes. Poets drinking themselves to death, and painters losing their minds, exert great fascination at the end of the century. Vincent lives with his younger brother in Paris for 2 years.
Theo, I'm back. Good.
The art dealer brings Vincent into contact with the Parisian avant-garde, painters whose works finally banished the old-fashioned from Van Gogh's works.
Vincent, can you come here, please? I was able to buy one of Toulouse-Lautrec's paintings.
Poudre de Riz is the name of the portrait of the young woman at the table. Vincent is thrilled, and at the same time inspired to evolve the avant-garde style even further.
See here how the color draws the eye? And now imagine the tablecloth blue and the tin orange. How intensely that would shine.
Toulouse-Lautrec, Georges Seurat, Louis Anquetin or Émile Bernard. Vincent's new acquaintances have long been experimenting with shapes and colours, dots and surfaces. Van Gogh wants to be like them, but here too, he remains an outsider.
He goes to the soirees of Toulouse-Lautrec, and Susan van der Dawn tells afterwards what this consisted of. Simply a boy, a person who came in with a canvas underneath his arm, would sit in the corner, would say nothing, and at the end of the soiree he left again.
But Vincent also pushes ahead enthusiastically with his painting on his own. In no time at all, he masters the stylistic devices of the avant-garde. He feverishly experiments with the element that would retain the greatest significance for him until the end of his life: colour. With the help of woolen threads, he tests contrasts with which he wants to increase the intensity of his pictures. It is the awakening of an exceptional artist.
It's not that he abandons what he's done in the Netherlands. He's transforming it, but he's keeping to the very pronounced brushstrokes and his very personal style.
His artistic transformation is made clear by two self-portraits that Van Gogh painted in Paris. The first was painted shortly after his arrival and is still in the old earth colours. The second he paints shortly before his departure, a self-confident artist, in Van Gogh's famous cobalt blue. However, his face also shows signs of exhaustion.
In Paris he got lost. It has something to do with the stress, indeed, to be part of the avant-garde at the time. And for that reason he went to the south of France and had a kind of idea that that was paradise, which of course it wasn't, but that's what he expected of it.
Vincent van Gogh arrives in Provence in the spring of 1888. It is the beginning of the two most important years of his creative life. In the meantime, he has thrown off the shackles of realistic portrayals. Here he finally wants to paint things as he sees them and feels them. He wants to capture the truth, the essence of things, and in doing so, he breaks the boundaries of art at the time. Without regard for his health, he paints everything he sees in front of his canvas on a piecework basis. 180 paintings in just over a year, an enormous legacy, and a captivating style.
The sheer physicality of these paintings and the very bright, vivid colour schemes, and most of all, the emotions that this conveys, you really sense it's the feeling that he wanted to convey.
The city of Arles and its surroundings are now both the setting and the motif for his work. This is where he takes up residence. Are his aspirations now fulfilled in Arles?
I think he remained the outsider. He was not part of the community in that sense. I mean, he was looked upon by the people in the town. Who's this strange artist wandering around?
Van Gogh's Café Terrace in the Evening is one of the paintings created in Arles, so famous today that the café is one of the main attractions for tourists visiting Provence. Just a few hundred meters further on Place Lamartine, is the no less famous Yellow House. Van Gogh rented it in the late summer of 1888 and captured his new home on canvas in glaring contrasts. On the first floor, he furnishes his bedroom. He paints it in colors that are meant to convey peace and security to the viewer. Not in the picture, 12 chairs that he buys as soon as he moves in, for all the artist's colleagues who are to work and live with him in Arles.
His bedroom is the one on the left, and the one on the right is going to be Gauguin's bedroom when he comes to stay. Because Vincent had a plan. Wouldn't it be great? I'm living in this house, I love this little town, you can get around, there's a million subjects that we can paint. Why don't I create a studio of the South?
An artist commune. Van Gogh paints sunflowers in all variations to express his joy at the guests he hopes will soon arrive. He finds it easier to communicate his feelings with color than with words. Probably the most famous of the sunflower paintings can be admired today in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. But what did Vincent's welcome picture look like when he painted it and the colors had not yet faded? After Charlotte Caspers has completed her analyses, she can finally begin to repaint the masterpiece with the scientifically reproduced original colors. She knows from the artist's correspondence that he planned his paintings meticulously. Contrary to the myth of the impulsive, mad genius, his works were well thought out in the best sense, but he was incapable of painting slowly.
With Van Gogh in general, he works often spontaneous, but you can compare it with sporting. When you run every day, you're very, very good in it. And it's also with the rhythm of his brush strokes and the thickness of his paint. And that's because he's doing it every day. That's his spontaneity, but also this organization in it. It's really difficult to mimic, and it's very unnatural to copy very secure with all this research data, a painting that was painted really quickly. So that's always the tension. I should paint that quick as well, but then it would not be a reconstruction of his painting, then it would be my painting. When somebody stands behind me and looks at the painting, I feel very vulnerable. I feel like they think that I'm exaggerating, whereas I'm using the same pigments.
To see the world through Van Gogh's eyes, thanks to Charlotte Caspers' reconstruction, we can experience this impression 130 years later. This is what the sunflowers look like today. And this is how they might have looked when the painting was still wet on Van Gogh's easel, before the red faded and the yellow discolored.
For me, it was an important moment, yeah. I suddenly thought, okay, this is Van Gogh's religion. Because the color that you see there is indeed so fresh, so colorful, that you indeed get, you're glad.
I feel what I paint. I paint what I feel, Van Gogh once wrote. When he painted the sunflowers in Arles, he must have been very happy. And full of anticipation. The painter Paul Gauguin confirms his arrival, finally a brother in spirit with whom he hopes to share life and art. But in expectation of his guest, Vincent works even harder and faster. In anticipation, he tires and burns himself out, recklessly.
When you look at how he worked, how immensely productive he was almost working day and night on paintings. He was not eating well, he was drinking too much. I mean, he did do a lot of harm to his health. Before Gauguin came, he actually wrote that he was so tired that he had to sleep for 2 days and take some rest, which he didn't want to because he wanted to do all these paintings.
For the eagerly awaited guest, the famous sunflowers. They were actually created as wall decoration for Paul Gauguin's room. What happens next is still the subject of much speculation today. The author, Bernadette Murphy, has painstakingly reconstructed what exactly happened in the Yellow House in the autumn of 1888 on the basis of countless documents in the Arles Town Archives.
Merci beaucoup.
Vincent's idea of an artist's commune was to come to a dramatic end, shortly after Gauguin's arrival in Arles. An undernourished and overexcited yet highly ambitious Van Gogh and the self-confident Gauguin. Two exceptional artists, but also two excessive characters in a confined space. That could not go well for long.
Finally, things start to go a little bit strange towards the end of the month, November. The weather is changing, they can't go out and paint quite so much. They start arguing about pretty much everything.
Do I really seem like that to you? Like a monkey with a paintbrush?
At the beginning, when Gauguin came, he was, I tend to think, a little bit more friendly to Gauguin in the terms of, well, eager to learn something from Gauguin. But at the end of the stay of Gauguin, he certainly tried to do and to show Gauguin what he was capable of doing.
The true artist creates paintings from his imagination, from his memory.
Have you still not understood it? I want to see the truth of things, and then I want to capture it on canvas.
The quarrels continue to escalate until the day before Christmas Eve.
Just because you can't paint from memory doesn't mean all the other artists in the world have to do without.
I can only recognize what is true when I see it in front of me. I can't just make it up and then... That is a lie! You're lying to the viewer, man!
And the reality of your sunflowers is a color that makes you go blind.
After this dispute, Gauguin probably wanted to turn his back on Van Gogh for good.
Van Gogh was just ruined by this because he had worked so hard to create a little community of artists. He had finally gotten Gauguin to come down and live with him. And deep down, I think he understood that he would never be able to live with anybody.
Vincent's really showing more and more signs of disturbance. I'm going to tell you what I've concluded to try and understand what happened. Sometime after dinner, Gauguin goes into the park.
In his memoirs written many years later, Gauguin claims that Van Gogh threatened him with a gun in Arles.
A cutthroat razor, and he was sufficiently scared, and Vincent returns to the Yellow House.
Gauguin does not follow him. Instead, he spends the night in a hotel. Meanwhile, the drama unfolds in the Yellow House. That night, with the very razor he had previously wielded to threaten Gauguin, Van Gogh inflicts a serious injury to his own ear.
He made a summary bandage out of rags and then walks the 5 minutes to the House of Tolerance #1.
The street where the brothel was located still looks the same today.
So here we are now in Rue du Boule d'Arles. Unfortunately, the House of Tolerance #1 no longer exists. It was on the corner here, just behind my back. You can see that there's cars parked here now, but the walls are still there. Vincent van Gogh came here, walked up the street. He must have seen a light on the corner. It was the most prominent of all the brothels.
What happens next was reported to a gendarme shortly afterwards by eyewitnesses at the brothel. Later, the mysterious events even end up in the local newspaper.
Can you fetch Rachel, please?
Rachel!
Take good care of it, please.
Give it to me.
Until his death, Van Gogh remained silent about what moved him to harm himself so severely. But he did process this event in his paintings. In the dormitory of the asylum in Arles, for example, the asylum where Vincent was taken the next day after a policeman found him unconscious at home. And in Self-Portrait with a Bandage. But what actually happened? What exactly did Van Gogh do to himself that night? In the course of her research, Bernadette Murphy also comes across a document in the archives of the University of Berkeley that could solve this more than 130-year-old mystery. It was made by one of the few people who saw Van Gogh's injury, his doctor in Arles.
It was a dream document to find. It's just a ripped-off piece of paper from a doctor's prescription form, and it's dated 1930. 18th of August, 1930. It says, the ear was cut with a razor.
And the doctor even describes how Van Gogh must have proceeded.
Vincent pulled up his ear, took a razor, and sliced through his ear. And then it says what the ear looked like afterwards. And then he gives a little thing. He says, I'm very happy to give you this testimony about my unhappy friend, and he signs it Dr. A.
A few months after this fit, Vincent moves at his own request from Arles to the mental asylum in Saint-Rémy, 30 kilometers away. His mental and spiritual state unsettles him. Taking care of himself costs him too much energy. Above all, Vincent wants to justify Théo's trust and finally find success. And to do that, he has to keep painting against all odds. He is now 36 years old. In his 9 years as an artist, he has not managed to stand on his own 2 feet financially.
Yeah?
Your brother has sent a parcel.
Ah, finally. I sent him a list 3 weeks ago with all the colours that I urgently need. My brushes have all lost their hair. Thank you.
Theo, now married, still sends him paints, brushes and canvases regularly. These utensils are more important than medicine for the restless artist, artist's lifeline during this agonizing period. When he is afflicted by fits, he is unable to paint. But in the phases in between, Van Gogh continues to create masterpieces such as the famous Starry Night. In this fantasy landscape, he mixes the world outside his window with memories and feelings in a grandiose pictorial symbiosis. The swirls of clouds and stars in particular stand out with their undulating lines. Some art historians see in them the expression of inner ecstatic states, which, according to Van Gogh in his letters, the sight of nature always triggered in him. At the same time, however, the stars also seem to have been a source of comfort and hope for him.
At one point, he actually says in his letters, when I have a feel for something, for religion, I go out and paint the stars.
In the center of the picture, Van Gogh has even hidden a wistful memory of his childhood. Church steeples like this are not to be found in Provence, but they are in his Dutch homeland. Today, it is difficult to know for sure what demons tormented the patient Vincent van Gogh. At the time, the director of the institution in Saint-Rémy believed it to be epilepsy with delusional ideas. It was to remain unchallenged as the sole diagnosis. Knowledge about mental illness was limited at the time, and the only therapy, regular baths, does not help Vincent either. After a year, he finally gives up his confinement experiment and turns his back on the south of France.
He realizes, of course, that he has to go through society to become better. He needs people around him. I mean, he's living amidst patients. Come on, that doesn't help you.
In the summer resort town of Auvers-sur-Oise, north of Paris, Vincent van Gogh tries one last time to stand on his own 2 feet. Here, in the Auberge Ravoux, he lives cheaply and all alone. Several times he tries to lure Theo and his wife Johanna to visit, but this last attempt to find a family also fails. Instead, a terrible quarrel breaks out in Paris between the brothers, who are always very close. During this time, Vincent is under the medical care of Dr. Gachet, the man whose portrait will later fetch a record price. But Dr. Gachet will no longer be able to help Vincent. A few days after the confrontation with Theo, on the 27th of July 1890, Vincent van Gogh goes to the fields behind the church of Auvers. There he tries to take his own life with a revolver. Badly injured, the painter drags himself back to the auberge. The doctor who is summoned cannot save Vincent van Gogh. Theo has rushed from Paris and sits in the chair next to him. Vincent dies 2 days later, aged only 37.
It's clear that he was not hopeful for the future, that he had a lot of worries, that he was depressed. The fact that he didn't want to be a burden for Theo anymore was probably part of it. But there's not one reason, I think, why he decided to end his life.
The painter is buried in the Auvers cemetery. His brother Theo only lives half a year longer. He dies of syphilis. The artist and his brother patron rest side by side to this day. Vincent van Gogh painted 90 paintings in the 70 days he spent in Auvers. One of the last, a kind of legacy, wheat field with crows. Vincent wrote to his brother that he wanted to express sadness and extreme loneliness with this painting, but also the vitality, the force of nature, which fascinated him throughout his life. The myth of the mad painter claims Van Gogh painted like this because he was crazy. His letters and his art paint a different picture. Van Gogh painted in this way because his soul was so fragile, his sensibility so vulnerable, and his art was perhaps his only gateway to life. Even painting could not save Vincent van Gogh in the end, but it made him immortal. His life has moved and influenced millions of people. His example has freed artists all over the world from the constraints of realism and encouraged them to experiment freely with colors and form.
He became an example for every artist. If you want to achieve something and you have a goal, please try it, do it. And knowing that certain risks were involved. Because you could fail, because you could not sell, because you could pour. But if you believed in it, hey, try it.
There's a sentence in his many letters in which he says, "Nothing could make me happier than that the average person would hang my paintings on their walls."
His wish actually came true. With his paintings, he succeeded in connecting with the souls of people all over the world. This gave Vincent van Gogh the companionship that was denied him throughout his life.